Welcome to episode 58 of Lucretius Today. I am your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any question about those, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information or to add your own comments to our episode. This week we will be discussing the section in Book 4 that appears at Latin lines approximately 722 to 822, and we'll be discussing the mind's direct receipt of images. Now let's join the discussion with Elaine reading today's text.
And now attend and observe in short what things affect the mind, and from whence proceed those objects that make an impression upon it. First, then, I say that subtle images of things, a numerous train of them, wander about in every way and in various manners. These, as they meet, easily twine, and are joined together in the air, as threads of gold or the web of a spider. For these are much finer in their contexture than those images that strike the eye and move the sight. These pierce through the pores of the body, and move the subtle nature of the mind within, and affect the sense. Hence it is that we see Centaurs, and the limbs of Scyllas, and the heads of Cerberus, and the shadows of those who have long since been dead, and whose bones are rotting in the grave. Because images of all kinds are ever wandering about. Some of their own accord are formed in the air, some are continually flying off from various bodies, and others rise from these images mixed together. For it is certain that the image of a centaur never flowed from one that was alive, for there was never such an animal in nature. But when the image of a horse met by chance with the image of a man, it immediately stuck to it, which it easily does by reason of the subtlety of its nature and the fineness of its texture. And all other monstrous figures are formed after the same manner. These images being exceedingly light and easily put in motion, as I observed before, each of them affects the mind at one stroke, for the mind is of a very subtle nature and wonderfully disposed to move. That the mind is moved, as I observed, by the images of things, you may easily collect from hence that what we perceive by the mind is exactly what we see with our eyes, and therefore they must of necessity be both affected by the same thing, and in the same manner. And so when I said, for instance, that I see a lion by means of the image that strikes upon the eyes, I know by the same rule that the mind is moved by another image of a lion, which it equally and no less sees than the eye sees the image proper to it, with this difference only, that the mind can perceive images of a more thin and subtle nature. Nor from any other reason is the mind awake when the body is asleep, but because those very images affect the mind which were used to move the sense when we were awake, so that we fully believe we see a person who has long since been dead and buried in the grave, and it cannot well be otherwise, because all the senses of the body are obstructed and bound up by sleep, and therefore have no power to convince us of the contrary. Besides, the memory is feeble and languishes by rest, and makes no objection to satisfy us, that the man has been long in the arms of death, whom the mind really believes it sees alive. And then it is no wonder that the images seem to move and to throw their arms and the rest of their limbs to exact time, and thus they seem to do when we are in a dream. For when the first image is gone and another springs up in a different posture, the first, we think, has changed its shape. And all this, you must conceive, is done in an instant of time. There are many other inquiries about things of this nature, and we must enter into long disputes if we attempt to give a distinct answer to every one. First, then, it is asked, how is it that whatever we desire to think of, the mind immediately thinks upon that very thing? Is it that the images are always ready at the command of the will? Does the image immediately occur to us the moment we desire? If we fancy to think of the sea, the earth, the heavens, of senates, shows, feasts, battles, does nature form these and provide them ready at our nod? especially since the minds of others that are in the same country and in the same place with us think things quite different from these. And then, since we see images in our sleep to step to time, to move their pliant limbs and throw about their tender arms alternately and keep due measure with their feet, are they taught this by art? Have they learnt to dance, that thus they play their wanton sports by night? Is not this the truth, rather, that what we take for one moment of time, this present now, has many parts included, as we find by reason? And therefore it is that in every instant there are 1,000 different images, always ready in every place. So numerous are they, and so apt to move, and then they are so exceedingly subtle that the mind cannot possibly perceive them distinctly without the nicest diligence. And so those images die away unobserved, which the mind does not apply itself to receive, but it does apply itself closely to distinguish the image it hopes to find and therefore sees it. Don't you observe that the eyes, when they would discover an object exceeding small, contract themselves close and provide for it, nor can they accurately distinguish except they do so? And you will find, even in things ever so plain, unless you strictly apply your mind, they will be as if they were utterly obscure and at the greatest distance undiscovered. Where is the wonder, then, that the mind should lose the observation of all other images but those it particularly inquires after and is employed about? Besides, we often mistake small objects for great, and so we contribute to our own delusion and impose upon ourselves. It happens likewise that sometimes an image of a different kind presents itself to the mind. Thus the form that was before a woman now shows itself a man, or some other person of a different age and complexion. But this we are not to wonder at, since the senses are all asleep, and we are wholly in a state of forgetfulness.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, for reading that. I think that if we were to come up with a list of topics in Epicurean philosophy that people would be surprised to hear about, this one might be near the top of the list, because we're all familiar with pleasure and virtue and all the other issues of Epicurean gods and many other issues that are controversial and so forth. But this is one which we really don't hear discussed very much at all. And it is, to my mind, something that is so out there in terms of where he gets it from and what he's thinking, that it really deserves a lot more scrutiny than I think people would otherwise give to it. So there's a lot in these paragraphs. This is about 100 lines, and it's a lot of detail on this particular topic. So I think we're going to need to go through each passage relatively closely. But before we do, let's take some general comments. Like last week, let's start with Martin. Martin, do you have any general thoughts before we start today?
Yeah, he dwells here on these imaginary images which only the brain sees and not the eye, and then describes there in detail how this works and the consequences. And of course, this is the wrong concept, but it's still then interesting that by starting from a set of assumptions, then he works out something which is at least plausible, or it was plausible at that time.
Yeah.
Martin, do you have any thought about why he has come back to the topic of images? Because this was the images seen by the eye were fairly early in this book 4, but now he's returning to it and talking about the relationship of the images that the mind collects versus those that are seen by the eyes. Do you have any thought about why he's come back to it now instead of dealing with it at the same time he dealt with the eyes?
Because this one is somewhat different.
Mm-hmm.
Because when he was writing about the eyes, that was in the context of the senses. So and that one is directly can be directly experienced. But this one with these images for the mind, this is something where is no direct evidence. So this is a concocted up things put together, put up some explanation. So I think it's very careful of him to separate this, because this makes this. I'm pretty sure that this one, I mean, he based on that Epicurus thought this through in a way that it would work out, but he certainly will have had a bit of doubt, which he didn't have with the regular senses.
Okay, well, right there where you said with the regular senses, is it possible that Epicurus is considering this aspect of the mind as a sense in exactly the same way that he's talking about eyes and ears and taste and so forth?
Not really, because this one he cannot really take as a measure of reality.
Do you mean that you don't see those people with their limbs swerving and dancing and so forth? You don't observe those yourself, Martin?
I mean, this one I don't really fully understand what he means, but I guess is what he's describing there is what we see in our dreams, correct?
Well,
Yeah.
I haven't seen those in my dreams lately. Has anybody on the podcast here seen those things that he seems to be talking about these as if everybody observes them, and they're commonly observed.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Elaine.
Well, first because I hope we'll go through this bit by bit. So I would like to get to that one, but the first thing I want to say is why did he take this up separately? I actually do think he's describing a sense, and I think if we go through it, we'll see that he's not talking about what used to be thought of as the five senses, but as the mind definitely is going through the pores, is what he says. So I think the reason that he's doing this is that he's building a model of reality, and it's in opposition to the idealists, the Platonists, who thought that we could perceive an non-material realm with our mind. And so he has got to come up with some explanation for imagination that doesn't involve a non-material realm. And this is what he did. He's decided, there are these material images penetrating through our skin, going into directly into our minds, which is not how it is, but it direct argument against idealism. So I while Martin was talking, I looked at the definition of imagination and now, so under Merriam-Webster, the first
images, imagination. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, the definition that we have today of imagination: the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. And so that still fits to me with this whole thing. So our imagination is a huge part of human experience. So if he didn't address it specifically, to me it would have been a glaring omission. And I just keep it in context of what he's fighting against, which is that somehow our mind is interacting with something immaterial. And that is definitely not happening. So just because his explanation turned out to not be correct, I think the most important thing to look at is what he was arguing against is still not correct.
Okay. Well, we're still talking in a general phase before we go into each particular passage. But yeah, I've never thought about what you just said. Imagination is a word that's based on images. Yeah. And we throw the word imagination around and we talk about it all the time without really ever discussing what the mechanism of imagination really is. We just talk about it in general. But I presume that when we talk about imagination, we're thinking about some kind of an action of the mind working on our memory. I'm thinking memory has more of a context for us today. And of course, he's talking about memories a little bit here, but he's going further and saying that he asked the question. And okay, we'll have to get to the individual sections. That's so much in here. Let's just go on to let's just go through it in sequence to start with before we just get too far out of context. So, okay, the first passage we have here is talking about basically that the images pierce the pores of the body and move into the mind, and that's how we can sometimes see centaurs and so forth. So what do we get out of this first passage here, from the now attend the things that affect the mind all the way up to the point that the images are of a subtle nature and the mind is wonderfully disposed to move? What do we get from that passage?
I have some things, but I want to hear Martin or Charles first, or both.
Yeah.
Okay, so here he makes this, he postulates that like he postulated before for the images which the eye can see, that these images travel as an entity from the source to the eye. And this is from today's perspective a nonsensical model. So it's something what might have been plausible at that time, but which from today's perspective does not make sense.
Yeah.
Charles, are you able to say anything on this?
No, but I'm looking for that section where Epicurus says that, or he makes a brief comment about the dreams of madmen moving in their sleep.
Right, that's relevant to this too. Now, I was remembering when Martin was giving his first general commentary on it, he made a comment about the difference between what the mind perceives versus what the eyes perceives. But then this, I don't want to move too far past the first passage, but the second passage here is saying that they're basically exactly or very similar. He's saying that what we perceive by the mind is exactly like what we see with our eyes. And therefore, they must of necessity be affected by the same things and in the same manner.
Yeah, so I would like to, let's first focus on these pierce through the pores of the body and move the subtle nature of the mind within and affect the sense. Look at that translation. Let's look at Monroe. And provoke sensation is Monroe, and Bailey, and arouse its sensation. So that little part to me says pretty clearly that this is a sense kind of experience in his opinion. So to me, I would think now, and I really object to too much extrapolation of Epicurus's description of things to modern, because you kind of have to pass through a metaphor first to make it like our modern understanding. But I think it would be a mistake not to point out, as we have before a little bit, that there are at least two parts to what we experience as sense. There's the actual sensory organ and the peripheral nervous system, like the eye, like the retina and optic nerve, and then there is the brain, which processes the input that's coming through the eye, and we don't experience those really as being separate when we're seeing an object, but in our imagination with our visual cortex, that is part of our brain that really kind of belongs with the sense. It doesn't. You're not going to see things if you only had an eye and not a visual cortex. So he is seeing that there's something like this going on, and he's not completely wrong about that. But I do think he's thinking it's a literal material sense that's responding to literal physical images going through the skin.
Yeah. I mean, that's clearly, to my mind, one of the things that we take away from this passage is that regardless of the fact that nobody talks about it, regardless of the fact that it is not held up to be a major aspect of Epicurean philosophy when we discuss it today, clearly this passage of Lucretius just makes it absolutely certain that Epicurus was considering the mind able to receive information directly.
And specific, and not just information. So let's be specific. He thought because he didn't say the mind was receiving. Well, I don't know. Maybe we'll get to it. Smells.
Right
through the skin, but specifically a physical mechanism for imagination that's coming from the outside and not from actions of neurons and so on within the brain, but from the outside in. And I want to point out this little part here because I think y'all didn't agree with me that this is what Lucretius meant before, but it seems real clear to me because he's contrasting it here. He says, some of their own accord are formed in the air, some are continually flying off from various bodies, and others rise from these images mixed together. So when he mentioned that before about rising of their own accord, Cassius, you were saying, it just means that they're running into each other. But he's clearly contrasting. He's got three different ways that these images can come about. Some of them formed in the air of their own accord.
Okay.
Why would he contrast that as a separate thing from mixing the images if he didn't mean what he was saying?
Okay. Yeah. What about the other before we go too far, putting two words on spontaneously of their own accord. What does Monroe and Bailey say about that? Did they say the same thing? Because are we saying that? Is he saying there that there's a force which produces them? I mean, when you say on their own accord,
he doesn't say that though. Mm-hmm. So and where would they come from if they're not formed by interactions of the other images? So okay, Monroe says those which are spontaneously produced within the air. Bailey says created of their own accord, even in the air.
Of their own accord could imply an actual will or power or intent to produce it. I wouldn't think he thinks that.
Yeah, so spontaneously and of their own accord. I don't think he's just saying that they're mixed together, because that's a separate.
Right, you're right. There's also, when you say that he's talking about it separately, he does, I think, have a tendency to repeat himself using different phrases that are intended to mean the same thing. But in this case, I'm willing to go with you that he's saying that they are spontaneously produced. But I think you would agree that if he means spontaneously of their own accord or whatever, it's not because they are themselves able to summon themselves into existence by some form of will or anything or intent, right?
Oh, no. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying he has not yet explained this in a way which is not something from nothing. It's a little odd that he's left this. And, your explanation explanation last time was, he just means that they're running into each other in the air. And I thought, I don't think that's what he's saying. He would have said it that way if that's what he meant. And so
you're not saying that he means something from nothing, though. You're not saying that there was no image and the image came from absolutely nothing. Or are you suggesting that?
Well, he doesn't say that, but he does not what I'm saying is he does not give an adequate explanation. Because it's not from them running into each other. It's not from flying off of a body. It's saying of their own accord or formed in the air. And he doesn't say from what. So it's to me, a pretty gaping hole. And he's done it twice now.
Okay.
And so I think we should be on the lookout for if he has an explanation for it. But it's clearly not the explanation that you were given before, that it's just from collisions, because he has listed that separately.
Okay, well, I won't agree that that's clear, but let's see what Charles and Martin have to say. Do y'all have comments on that point? Because it's an excellent point that Elaine is raising. So, Charles and Martin? Charles?
No, nothing.
Martin, you have any thought there?
It's not written here, but I think elsewhere he mentions that images can get scattered, and then certainly these images for the brain can also get scattered. And that means these pieces of images are around. And because somehow he sees images and these brain images as somehow being something contiguous. So when there are pieces of scattered images, then so basically the individual particles, no? So they'll just move around and then can by chance come together. No?
But then how is that different from others rise from these images mixed together? I don't think I think he's got to be talking about something different, or he wouldn't have contrasted it. And whenever he goes to so much trouble to make something specific, I don't think it's a good idea to try to gloss it over and explain it away, especially in terms of something he's contrasting it with.
No, these images, when they're still contiguous, they can combine. But once they're scattered into their individual particles, they have nothing to do anymore with the previous image. So if then they combine into something new, it's completely new. It has nothing to do with what they have shown before.
And that could be, it could be, but he's never said that specifically.
No, he doesn't say.
So we should keep it in mind. Either it's just an explanation that he forgot to, because if I were reading this back in his time, I would say, what? You mean they come from nothing? And then he would have to tell me. But he hasn't done that. So I think it's a weird lapse to me that he he didn't address it, but we'll be on the lookout and see if he does at some point.
Okay. All right. I like the way you're reasoning, Elaine, because I do think we need to just look at the text and pull out of it what it seems to be saying before we really make a judgment about it. I think that's a very important process that we need to go through.
Yeah.
I don't have anything more definitive to add to what we've just said, though. So you're the one who's probably going through this more sentence by sentence than we are. Where are we now in your reading of? So we move to the second passage we have here now, or do you have more to say about the first passage?
Yeah, I think we can go on to the next one before we get into maybe a little bit more. Like you said, we should talk about what he's saying before we talk about what the modern understanding is.
Yeah, because we're just not familiar with what he's saying much at all, I don't think.
Right.
Most
but
of us are not
I think we can agree. I do think we should agree that it's very clear that he's talking about all of these things coming from outside and not from something, an image of the horse, which was still in the mind, combining with the image of a man in the mind, but that combination happens from the outside and then goes through the skin in his model.
Yes, we'll get to it as we go further, but he asked the question just several lines down. Are we saying that these images are just out there all the time? And he seems to answer that affirmatively. Yes. Let's wait a paragraph more.
Yeah.
So the second passage that we have is where it says the mind is moved by the images, and we see the same thing, that the images of a lion that strikes the eye, that the mind is moved by another image of the lion, which it equally and no less sees. The difference only that the mind can perceive images of a more thin and subtle nature. So I'm just going to echo what you just said, Elaine, that whatever else we get from what we've read so far is the mind is being affected from outside the mind.
Yes.
And if you want to combine what we're discussing today with some of the other discussion of the gods, it's hard to kind of disconnect those two, because he's apparently saying that something from outside the mind to cover all sorts of topics. So,
and not just, okay, so I want to be clear again. So the mind can be affected from outside the mind, obviously, through like your gut bacteria can affect your mood, so it's and can things like the weather and barometric pressure affect your mood. I think we have some evidence for that. So it's not that I don't think anybody should be arguing that the mind is there's a mind reality barrier that we're not affected at. But he's saying there's a specific physical passing of image particles through the skin into the mind. So it's real specific, and I don't think we should generalize it.
Okay. Let's move to the next passage, which seems to focus on when you're asleep.
Yeah.
And that the memory is not active when you're asleep. And so therefore the memory doesn't say to us, well, I can't be seeing an image of George Washington because George Washington has been dead for 200 years.
This is great, because it's really clear that he doesn't see the memory as having any role in imagination other than policing it. So he doesn't like, if I close my eyes and remember my mother, it's not my memory function in my brain that's doing that in his mind. The image is supplied in a different way than by memory. And that's really pretty fascinating and different from the way we understand it now.
The only comment I would have on what you just said is I guess I can see that he would not rule out that the two can work together, but he's clearly saying that there are images from the outside that are separate and distinct from the memory, which can lead you to see these things.
I don't think he ever says that memory can itself produce an image.
That's a good question.
I would be on the lookout for that, but it seems to be.
What is a memory what is a memory if not an image?
Right. Well, that's how we think of it today, but he's describing it differently. So.
What is he? Okay, that's the point I would like to make sure we continue to try to do is we have to make sense of what he's saying, because I can't believe that he would understand memory differently than we would. Yeah,
but look, he's saying his memory. The objection of memory would be more of a knowledge that the man has been long arms of death. So the memory is not, he's not talking about memory producing images. I don't see that anywhere in here. And we could be on the lookout for it, but the way he's using memory is more like a thought function that's separate from images. It's really fascinating.
Martin or Charles, before we move on, any comments?
No.
Okay. And then this next passage is the one that I'm kind of caricaturing throughout the discussion today. Seeing these things with their limbs moving to exact time, throwing their arms and the rest of their limbs to exact time. And then one image is gone and another springs up in a different posture and in an instant of time. And then he ends that by saying that many other inquiries of this nature would lead us into long disputes if we tried to give a distinct answer to every one. But this is the first mention today or one of the first mentions today of this issue of the images throwing their arms and the rest of their limbs to exact time.
So I'm curious if anybody else understands this the way I do. So I want to hear what Charles and Martin think first, but I think it's pretty clear what he means.
Yeah, Martin and Charles, what do you interpret him to mean there? I mean, do you have dreams like that, Martin?
Yeah, not exactly like this, but I have weird dreams. So I can still remember a very weird dream from when I was a kid. I don't know what it was. Was it a person or something? I think it was a person was falling off a cliff. I tried to catch it, but when I caught it, it was a roe, so an animal. And then when I wanted to keep this, it turned into a small sphere, into a small metal sphere. No? So there are things, funny things are changing. No? And certainly, in the dream, when there are people, they move naturally. No? So the appearance of their movement appears naturally.
Charles, you have any comment on that?
Similar to Martin's, you get very vivid dreams time to time.
Do you have dreams of people dancing or kind of figures moving in a dance-like type of motion?
No.
Okay, well then let's let Elaine answer the question for us. What does he mean?
Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that he's talking about, because we're talking about these filmy images penetrating the brain one after another rapidly. He's talking about something like animation. Do you remember this little, if you did like me when you were a kid, you make these little flip books. Or they would sell them, and you could flip through them and it would look like the animation figure was moving. I mean, and that's really at least how they used to make animation, was just these painstaking drawings that had just a slight change, and then you put them in rapid sequence and the thing would be moving. So what he's saying is that because there's not a creature out there moving than we're seeing with our eyes, but instead we're getting these images that are just floating through the air, that because they're happening one after another, it gives the appearance of lifelike movement with a exact time, meaning normal looking movements like we would see these image films coming off of an actual person, but in the dream they're just combining these sequential images that are not really related to each other necessarily. They're coming off of different things, and then it changes its shape, but it looks like it's all a continuous thing.
Elaine, do you think that means that the mind's focus on the image is sort of sequentially flipping the pages of the book, or is it the image that itself?
The image is striking the mind sequentially.
Okay.
And the mind perceives that as like we would seeing a person moving around. And so the way he's describing this happens to all of us. Anytime we see any kind of thing moving in a dream, it's not because there's a thing we're looking at that's moving. It's because of, in his model, these sequential images that are giving that appearance.
Okay. Just keep moving, then we'll go to the next passage, and this one's got a lot in it here, because this is the issue of whether the mind is summoning somehow the images of the dead person, or whether there's just a constant supply of images out there and our mind is selecting from them, or what. So,
yeah,
who wants to start with that, Elaine?
Don't put me first.
Okay, Martin.
Martin,
Again, Martin, I know that we don't really have a high estimation of the current analytical value of this model, but if we try to at least first understand what his model is, he apparently is asking a question about whether there's just a limitless supply of all different types of images that are constantly surrounding us or not. Because he asked that question here in this passage. He doesn't really, in the first part of the passage, imply that he's necessarily going to go one way or the other. And in fact, it seems kind of unlikely that you'd have a limitless supply of all sorts of images of seas and earths and heavens and senates and feasts and battles all just flying through the air at any particular time. But he asked that question and then seems to give an answer to it. Mm-hmm. So what do you take from that one, Martin?
Yeah, I think he really means it like that. So
yeah, I do too.
So as unlikely as it appears as today, this is something what he says, and it's not really even in conflict with his model, because he says that these are very subtle, so they are made of very subtle particles, and there can be then a large number of them. No? So if we have something of complex solid bodies of which what we directly see and touch is composed, no? So that one is a lot more limited in what you can put in one place. But these images are so fine enough that many of them can fill a certain space.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Charles, anything at this point?
Yeah, I was curious about what exactly he was implying or meant about the images themselves dying unobserved.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess they could break apart, because they're kind of flying around. I don't think he means they're going into nothing, because he doesn't. But the image itself would, maybe break up and we didn't see it.
I was about to say we should maybe just go ahead and read the last passage as part of this, because it's all maybe one thought. But do you want to do that, or do you have more to say about this one first, Elaine?
I mean, I think it's all connected. So I mean, first he asked the question, as you say, and then he answers it here, and therefore it is that in every instance there are 1,000 different images always ready in every place, and numerous are they, and so apt to move. And then we notice them if we decide to notice them. So it's even though it's not how we think things are, it's a brilliant way of giving a material explanation to how we could be having these, how imagination could work by having these material, filmy, subtle images in the air going straight through our skin into the mind.
Well, let's since we're talking about it, and it's been a while since we read it, I mean, this is the part where he's saying that the eyes, or the mind, just like the eyes, the mind apparently is able to focus, basically. Yeah. I don't know if the word focus is in here, but that's basically what he's talking about, it seems to me, that he's saying that the mind focuses on what it chooses to focus on, and that the mind basically selects out from this unlimited supply of images the particular image that, for whatever reason, it chooses to focus on.
Right.
And it's not, to me, again, when he's asking the question, the way he's asking it, it's almost like he's not necessarily going in that direction, because my eye is caught by the, and maybe a good analogy for what we're talking about, my eye is caught by the words, have they learned to dance, that thus they play their wanton sports by night? To me, that's almost ridiculing the idea
definitely.
That the images have learned to dance.
Yeah, he's poking fun at alternate explanations first. Like he does that a lot. Like, really? Or do you really think this would happen? And no, here's how it is.
So maybe what he's focusing on there is again the images themselves do not contain any, that it's our mind that's creating from the images the result, not that the images are themselves learning to dance. Is that what you're getting from it, or something like that, Elaine?
No, because so he's saying he is saying that they don't have. He's not describing them as having consciousness, or but it's not our. It is the series of images hitting our mind directly, material particle interactions, that's creating our experience of imagination.
Okay, let me stop, Elaine. Clearly, that is at least one aspect of what he's saying, that these images from outside are coming in.
Right.
What's the role of the mind in focusing?
The mind is the decider. Yeah, the focus. It's a decision. I'm going to pay attention to this image and not that image. And he, he's comparing it to the way the lens, he didn't, I guess, know about that, but the lens itself, the ciliary muscles in the eye change the shape of the lens so that we can look at something very small versus something very far away. And of course, I think everybody here except Charles has personally lost that ability due to age. Charles, it's coming. It's coming for you. But that's something that happens really as an interaction between the central and the peripheral nervous system, making those muscles in the eye change the lens. So yeah, it's more of a decisive kind of decision action and not the mind itself creating the images.
Okay, I don't have any answers to suggest, but certainly if somebody's listening to this, they're going to want to compare the opening of book 1, where it talks about Epicurus casting his mind out into the universe. And I think people would also want to compare the discussion in Velleius of the images of the gods, because it's always been one of those counterintuitive issues that the images that Velleius says that the images are traveling to the gods as opposed to from the gods. So I think I've seen commentators speculate about how this projection of the mind that might be involved in the focusing that we're talking about here is related to these issues that there's images traveling towards us, but that our mind actually is selecting from among those images, and maybe our mind is taking an active role in deciding which images it's going to look at and think about and focus on.
Yeah, and to me, one of the interesting things is that we're only choosing from an available menu.
Yeah.
So we can choose, but we're not creating the menu.
Yeah, that's a free will type of a question there.
There's still a choosing, right? There's still he still sees us as choosing, but there's no creative act in these images for him, which is totally different from how. I mean, now today we associate imagination with creativity, but this is not. This is a non-creative imagination process. It's a curation process, I guess. You're choosing what you want to look at, but you don't get to actually make the thing that you're looking at in your mind.
And the frustrating thing to me right this second is that anybody listening to this podcast is going to know that where we go from here after today is another extremely challenging discussion of, I think, what people consider to be basically evolution, because he's, after this passage, going to make the point that we can't conclude that just because we have an arm, it was designed to be an arm. And so what you've just observed about it not being necessarily a creative process, at least in this section right here, I don't know that we should conclude that just because we're reading this and we're choosing from a available selection doesn't mean that there's not some other part of the philosophy somewhere else where he says you can come up with your own. But at least right here, you're exactly right. He's talking about selecting from among available images and not just creating those images within your, just as, it seems pretty obvious that we today think about just sort of in our own minds, in our taking the memories of things we've seen and combining them in different ways, in new ways that have not been combined before, like the horse and the man creates the centaur.
Yeah.
We think of that pretty normally today. And I have to feel like, since we think about it fairly normally, the idea certainly occurred to Epicurus as well. So he must have an explanation for how we create things that have never been
I think this is it, Cassius. But now, if we find another passage that adds another thing, yes, we should be on the lookout. But I think he is exactly answering your question for his model of it, that we're not creating those images, that they were out there and they come to our minds. But we'll see.
Well, maybe one way of asking that would be, as we've been discussing already today, the images can get mixed together at the very least, And if your reading of it is correct, Elaine, they can really somehow form themselves into combinations that did not exist before. And that's basically what he's saying, that the images
and that we
can.
did, right. That's exactly what he's saying. And that we see them because we decide to, but we don't create them.
Right. Is there a place in his theory for us, for our own minds, to manipulate those images and rearrange them in ways that they've not been combined before? That's not what he's describing here.
Nope.
But personally, I have to believe that he would have had an explanation for that. I mean, artists.
Well, this is his explanation, though.
Well,
it's very comprehensive. I mean, if we find something different, I'll change my tune. But I think this is a very complete model that he's put before us of his explanation for how imagination is material.
But this is how imagination is material. Okay, if you're limiting the discussion to imagination and considering that to be sort of what's being described here sounds to me like a very passive process.
Yes.
Although on the other
deciding.
hand, the mind is deciding. So I don't know.
So it's not exactly passive, but it's just that we're deciding from a menu, and I don't see that he's left any. It's just hard to. We're so used to, Cassius, our modern understanding of imagination, that it is hard to imagine that other people before us might not have thought about it that way. But I mean, that just goes to show you how research and science kind of trickle down to a point where it seems like, oh, well, that seems obvious. You know, how could you think about it any other way? Well, people did think about it other ways, you know. So,
Elaine, the way you're describing that when you say this discussion of imagination, that word imagination today would probably convey the idea that it's all made up and that none of it's real.
No. Okay, so that's why I went back and read the definition. Let me go back to it. So today we say we are forming it. So it says the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality.
Now that last part is maybe the more controversial part, never before perceived in reality.
Right. So he says that, though. He says like the image of the man and the horse, and it's never existed. And number 2 definition in Merriam-Webster is creative ability. So today, I'll read again, the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses. Lucretius would say the act or power of choosing to perceive a mental image, so that we're not forming it. It was already formed. It's preformed outside of our heads, going through our skin, but we are choosing to perceive this, something that's not present to our ordinary senses or hasn't been perceived in reality, because these images are flying around in the air and running into each other, so they're not really representing a real material object, but they themselves are material objects.
Charles and Martin, before Elaine and I get too carried away, what other thoughts do you guys have?
Yeah, I have no further comment.
All right, Charles?
As with Martin, it's been quiet on my end.
Well, I've always known that I'm not necessarily pushing a particular interpretation of many of these issues. My mind is open as to what a lot of these things may mean. My goal is hopefully that we can stimulate thought and spur the desire to read into this more deeply and think about what he could be saying and help everybody sort of reconstruct in their own minds a more comprehensive understanding of Epicurus's approach. And I hope and think that we are making some progress on that goal anyway.
Yeah. And, this passage seems to be very literal. It's not a real poetic passage, right? Because he's really describing a mechanism. There's a risk in Lucretius of taking metaphorical things literally, like when he's talking about Venus in the beginning, and that's clearly poetic, versus, when he's really describing a literal concrete mechanism, it could be tempting to try to metaphorize that. And I think we should resist that temptation. I think somehow it's interesting how does Lucretius help us know when he's talking about something, that he really means concretely versus I don't think he's as flowery
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of his
Right.
clues to us, that I'm not talking about metaphor here. I'm not doing poetry. This is your science textbook part.
Right. Well, listen, before we're sort of beginning to come to the conclusion, but we really haven't touched on this very last paragraph, which probably has a very important caveat about all this, which is the mistaken conclusions we can reach due to these images and the way we receive them. Because he ends this with the reference to the form that was before a woman now shows itself to be a man, or some other person of a different age and complexion. But we aren't to wonder about that, since the senses, and it's so funny, it's so strange to me how he refers to the senses are all asleep, but
Yeah.
he really does seem to be considering the mind as a sensory organism.
Yeah.
So in his own analysis, he is analogizing the mind to a sensory organism, but he's clearly seeing it as to be separate from the eyes, ears, and so forth.
Right.
And we are wholly in a state of forgetfulness. So he's separating out memory, as you're saying as well, Elaine.
Right.
Since the
They don't
senses
have our
are asleep.
executive functions like what we would say today. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I also want to point out that, and again, I don't think this is what he was talking about exactly, but he is a little bit with the actual vision, with the eyes open. But I think that we know that when we're looking around space, that our expectations play a strong role in what we're going to select out to see. You know, the classic experiment with the gorilla running out into the basketball court, and people who were told to watch for the players with, from one team would somehow bizarrely miss that there's this gorilla walking out onto the court and beating its chest. Well, not a real gorilla, but a person in a gorilla costume. That would kind of go in, with this. So the mind's decision for what to look at is a significant process.
Mm-hmm. I certainly agree with that. And I guess as we begin to close as well, what comes to my mind right this second is the Diogenes Laertius discussion of anticipations, because he's previously said in that discussion that Epicurus held that an anticipation is, at least in some respect, related to having seen a number of instances in the past of a particular thing, and then sort of combining those images into a composite, which we then use as a test to compare against something we see new. So at least in that context, it appears that memory has some role.
Well, memory is kind of evaluating these images the way he's laid it out here, but without making them. So it's, because, the way he has it, all these images are always out there. So it's not like we would have to create them if we wanted to remember something. The image is out there.
But Elaine, I think a lot of people would presume that Epicurus is also saying, in some places anyway, that the mind does observe things and form composite images, which are essentially either preconcepts or concepts. Are you disagreeing, or how do you fit that together?
No, I think the mind is classifying them. The mind is assessing them and evaluating them, but the images themselves are, in his model, are coming from the outside.
But you're focusing on that, but surely you agree that they store these images as well, that the mind also stores them.
Where is he saying that the mind stores them as an image rather than the image coming as a fresh supply?
I agree with you that he's not saying that here. I think there's other sections, though, where he would anticipate you would combine those sections with this, because I don't think that this section can be read to just eject the idea of memory of images. Are you going that far in your thought process?
We recognize he is proposing recognition of images as different from storing them or creating them. I haven't seen anywhere where he's saying that we have a little store. So, but I may have missed that.
And that is the same. That would be the same misconception. What some people, how people misunderstand how memory works. We don't store images in our brain.
We don't.
We store patterns. And if you see a new image, our pattern recognition works on these patterns and compares these patterns. And from there, we recognize images. It's not that we store images.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Okay, well, that's obviously a very important way of of talking about it than to clarify it in that way.
Because Martin's right. If Epicurus did think that we store the images, then that's not right either. But that's how a lot of people popularly think about it today. About the brain.
Right.
And it's quite interesting. So from this concept of pattern recognition, so his idea on this one is actually closer to what we understand today than the simplistic idea that we have a bitwise storage of images in the memory. No?
Yeah, except that the patterns we're recognizing are not coming always from they're definitely not coming through our skin into our brain.
Yes.
All right, we probably ought to begin to close for the day because we may be going long for the second week in a row. Martin, how would you like to begin to close for the day?
No, everything's said, so no need to close for me.
Okay. Well, you certainly, in my mind, helped end the discussion with some very deep material that will probably lead in different directions, because I'm sure a lot of people think that we store images and therefore we'll have to possibly come back to that at some point. But let's save that for another day. Charles.
Yeah.
Anything to add before we begin to close today?
Not this week, no.
I'm thinking just a second before I move to Elaine. Charles, do you have a thought about what was just discussed in terms of does the mind store images versus patterns?
What do you mean?
Do you agree with that? I don't know that I've read much into that recently to have an opinion as to whether I agree or disagree with that statement. I mean, you'd have to break it down in a lot of different ways. The images that Epicurus is talking about here obviously have a particular meaning. I don't know whether we're in general discussion as we're talking about that an ordinary person might be thinking about. I'm not sure what an ordinary person, if they were asked to define what an image is, I'm not sure they could or would it be able to very easily. But do you have any impression as to what Elaine and Martin were just talking about, that the mind does not store images but stores patterns?
I mean, yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
I will look for some maybe some modern writing on imagination and memory in case anybody wants to look at that, just so we can see what the current state of affairs is, because it is a kind of hot topic in neuroscience research.
Yeah, I think that we could profitably come back to that. It strikes me as something that I don't think we talk about very much. And again, one of my goals would be to try to make all this understandable to a relatively educated but not necessarily specialist type person. And I suspect that this relationship between what the memory does and whether there are images stored in the mind, and if not images, what is stored, those things are things that people don't talk about or think about very often. And it probably does relate very closely to what Epicurus is talking about for us to have a clear understanding of our own thoughts about these things, and so that we can think about what Epicurus said. I think it's important to know what
the material process is. I mean, even though it's not from the outside, it's still relevant to a materialist philosophy to know that there are actual material mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely on that particular point, that all of this, everything that, I mean, we today, those of us who are trained or educated or brought up to be not materialists, we just don't often think about things like that. But Epicurus is, as Elaine said earlier in the discussion, he's extrapolating a totally materialist theory of everything out into these areas that people don't normally think about. So it may lead in unexpected directions, which I think that would be one way I would summarize what we've got going on here today, is that a lot of people who are just casually familiar with Epicurus would consider this discussion to be an unexpected direction of Epicurean thought.
Yeah.
So, okay, Elaine, how would you close for the day?
I would close with this section is the Epicurean model that attempts to explain imagination, dreams in a totally materialist way, so that there's nothing supernatural or idealist involved in us having the experience of images that are not coming through our eyes.
So when you're getting ready to fight the Battle of Philippi and you're Cassius and Brutus talking before the battle, and Brutus says that he has seen Caesar's ghost, you have an explanation for what Brutus may actually have experienced.
Right. And so you can say, yep, no, you didn't really, but it was a it wasn't also supernaturally generated. It has an explanation. It's just like, if you're hearing thunder, it's not the gods stomping around. It's just a material process.
I don't know if I'm remembering that from Shakespeare or whether it's in Plutarch's story of Brutus, but that's certainly part of the historical or literature record anyway, that Cassius and Brutus had that discussion.
When you said Shakespeare, I was thinking of Banquo's ghost.
No, well, that could be too, but no, I think in Shakespeare's Caesar, yeah, would be where that occurs. Or I think it may be in Plutarch as well. So anyway, okay, well, if no one has anything else for today, we'll close and come back in a week or so.
All right. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Yes, happy Valentine's Day. Thank you very much.
All right,
Talk to you
bye-bye.
soon. Bye.
Thanks, bye.